At 11:47 on a Friday night, my daughter texted me 7 words that no father ever wants to receive. "Dad, do you still have Mom's blue cooler?" To anyone else, it would have sounded harmless. A forgotten camping cooler. A family joke. A daughter asking her old father about something buried in the garage. But my hands went still over the grill, because 10 years earlier, after my wife died, I had taught Emily one rule. If you are ever in danger and cannot say it out loud, ask me about the blue cooler. And if you add the words, "no rush," it means someone is watching you type. Her second message came 12 seconds later. "No rush. Tomorrow is fine." I did not call her back. I did not ask if she was safe. I did not panic. Panic ruins evidence. I turned off the propane, wiped the grease from my hands, walked into the garage, and opened the black field case I had not touched since the day I retired. Preston Vale thought I was just a quiet old father-in-law who fixed lawnmowers and grilled burgers on Sundays. What he did not know was that before I became Emily's harmless old dad, I had spent 31 years with the United States Marshals Service, finding people who thought locked doors made them powerful. And on that Friday night, Preston had just locked the wrong woman inside the wrong house. It started long before the text message. Emily was 34 years old, intelligent, capable, and fiercely loyal. But the cage Preston built around her was not made of iron. It was made of increments, small, daily erosions of her independence that she convinced herself were normal. Preston was 38, charming, wore custom-tailored suits to casual family dinners, and spoke with the kind of unearned confidence that fools investors but terrifies investigators. I remember a barbecue we had at my house in Saginaw, Michigan, about 6 months before the blue cooler text. The air was thick with July humidity, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your spine. I was out back, kneeling in the damp grass, fixing the carburetor on Preston's expensive riding mower because he refused to pay a mechanic and did not know how to hold a wrench himself. Preston was standing on the wooden deck, holding a glass of iced tea with lemon. Looking down at me, Emily was standing next to him, holding a ceramic plate of sliced watermelon. "Your father is useful, Emily," Preston said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the cicadas. "I will give him that. He is a very useful man to have around when things break." Emily looked visibly uncomfortable. She shifted her weight, the plate trembling slightly in her hands. "Preston," she whispered, glancing down at me. "Don't say it like that. He is doing us a favor." Preston just laughed, a cold, empty sound. "I am just giving credit where credit is due, darling. We all have our roles. Ray fixes the machines, and I build the future. It is a perfect ecosystem." I did not stand up. I did not wipe the black oil off my hands and tell him to get off my property. I just tightened the bolt on the carburetor, closed the metal housing, and wiped my wrench on a rag. The man who reacts first almost never wins. Let them finish the lie. A half-told lie is just an argument. A fully told lie is a confession. I knew that if I challenged Preston right then, he would pivot. He would play the victim, accuse me of being an oversensitive old man, and use my anger to push Emily further away from me. So, I smiled. I handed him the keys to the mower and told him it was ready to go. But I started watching him. The isolation became physical. Emily used to call me every Tuesday evening on her drive home from the architectural firm where she worked. Those calls abruptly stopped. When I asked her about it, she gave me a heavily rehearsed excuse. "Preston thinks I spend too much time on the phone while driving," she told me, staring intensely at her coffee cup. "He says it is a distraction. He says I don't need my father approving every single decision I make during the week." Then came the physical signs. I noticed Emily wearing thick, long-sleeved sweaters in the middle of a sweltering August afternoon. I noticed her checking her phone obsessively, her eyes darting to the screen every time it vibrated, flinching slightly before she even read the notification. Every time I asked her if she was okay, Preston was suddenly standing right behind her, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. "She is just emotional, Ray," Preston would say, squeezing her shoulder tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "We are handling it. You raised her to be a bit too dependent. I am helping her grow up." It was during one of those moments that he saw it. The sleeve of her sweater rode up just an inch. There was a tiny, faded yellow bruise on the inside of her left wrist, the exact shape and size of a thumb pressing down hard. I looked at Emily. She looked away, her posture rigid. "Do you need the cooler, Emily?" I asked her quietly. She swallowed hard, her eyes filling with a terrifying, silent grief. "Not yet, Dad," she whispered. Not yet. I had taught her about the cooler 10 years ago, sitting on the exact same back porch where Preston now stood. My wife, Sarah, had just passed away from pancreatic cancer. Sarah had always been the one who believed in the inherent goodness of people. She was the one who insisted on packing extra ham and cheese sandwiches whenever we took our old camper out to the state parks, just in case someone else forgot their lunch. She always carried those sandwiches in a battered, bright blue plastic cooler with a white handle. The cooler had a cracked hinge on the right side and a faded, peeling sticker from Yellowstone National Park right in the center. Whenever Emily saw that blue cooler sitting on the kitchen counter, she knew we were going somewhere safe. When Sarah died, the house became overwhelmingly quiet. Emily, who was 24 at the time, came out to the porch and sat next to me. She was holding that blue cooler on her lap, tracing the cracked hinge with her thumb. "Mom always packed extra sandwiches," she had said, her voice breaking. I looked at the cooler, and I realized I could not protect her from the grief of losing her mother, and I could not protect her from every bad person she would inevitably encounter. But I could give her a way out. "Then this cooler is going to keep doing its job," I told her. "It is going to carry help." That was the night I gave her the code. I told her that if she ever found herself in a situation where she could not safely pick up the phone and ask for help because the person hurting her was standing right there in the room, she needed to use a language only we understood. I told her I would not come kicking down the door like a wild man. A rescue done wrong can easily become another trap. I promised her I would come correctly, with the right paperwork, the right witnesses, and the absolute certainty that the person hurting her would never be able to hide in the shadows again. For 10 years, that blue cooler sat empty on a shelf in my dusty garage. I watched her grow up, build her career, and marry Preston. I hoped the cooler would remain nothing more than a forgotten piece of camping equipment. But Preston's commercial real estate project was bleeding money. It was a massive, over-leveraged development on the east side of the county, entirely dependent on a new round of funding. His primary investors were getting nervous. He was desperately looking for a lifeline. Emily's mother had established an independent trust for her. It was separate property, protected from marital asset division. It was the one asset Preston had not been able to legally touch. About a month before the text message, Emily dropped by my house to bring me some groceries. She looked exhausted, nervously twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "Preston wants me to refinance the house," she said quietly, staring into her mug of black coffee. The house she had purchased entirely with her own trust money. "Why?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "He says his development project needs a short-term capital injection," she recited, her voice monotone. "He says that if I believe in our marriage, I should be willing to use the house as collateral. He says keeping the house separate means I am not fully committed to our future. Did you sign anything?" "No," she shook her head. I told him I needed time to think about it. What did he say to that? She looked out the kitchen window at the empty yard. He got very quiet. He told me I was acting like a child. He told me that if the project fails, it will be my fault for not supporting him. "You do not have to sign anything, Emily," I told her, placing my hand over hers. "The house is yours. Do not let him turn his failure into your guilt." She squeezed my hand. "I know, Dad. I won't sign it. I promise." I believed her. But I also knew men like Preston Vale. When their illusions of wealth and success begin to crumble, They do not apologize. They escalate. They create a situation where saying no becomes physically impossible. I knew Preston was going to lay a trap for her. I just did not know when, until 11:47 on a Friday night. When my phone buzzed on the railing next to the grill, I did not panic. I walked into the garage and opened the black field case. Inside was an old backup cellular phone, a list of emergency contacts, a certified copy of Emily's original trust documents, a blank revocation draft my attorney had prepared weeks ago, and a digital recording device. I took the items out of the field case and placed them carefully into the bottom of the dusty blue plastic cooler. Preston Vale thought he had successfully isolated her, broken her confidence, and cornered her into surrendering everything she owned. What he did not know was that her way out had been sitting in my garage for 10 years, and I was about to bring it right to his front door. I put the blue cooler into the passenger seat of my Ford pickup. I did not throw it. I set it down gently, ensuring it sat perfectly level against the worn fabric of the seat. I closed the passenger door, walked around to the driver's side, and climbed in. I put the key in the ignition, but I did not start the engine right away. I sat there in the dark garage, the smell of old engine oil and damp concrete hanging in the air, and I forced myself to take 3 slow, measured breaths. Most fathers would have driven straight there and kicked the door in. That is exactly what Preston wanted. An angry father makes excellent evidence for an abusive husband. In my 31 years as a marshal, I learned that a panicked rescue is just a second disaster. If I drove over to Preston Vale's house, kicked down his expensive mahogany front door, and started screaming, Preston would win. He would immediately call the police. He would point at me, the unhinged, violent father-in-law, and he would use my outburst to secure a restraining order. He would legally bar me from ever coming near Emily again. And he would have the paperwork to prove to a judge that Emily needed his protection from her own unstable family. I was not going to give him that ammunition. If Preston wanted darkness, I was going to bring witnesses. I picked up the backup cell phone I had placed in the cooler. It was an older model, heavy and reliable, untraceable to my current accounts. I dialed the first number on my emergency contact list. Dana Cross picked up on the second ring. Dana was one of the sharpest family law attorneys in Oakland County. She and I had worked together on a dozen domestic extraction cases over the years. She understood the intricate, invisible architecture of coercive control better than anyone I knew. Ray, she answered, her voice crisp and fully awake, despite the late hour. Dana, I need you at the Vale residence in 20 minutes, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I have a confirmed distress code from Emily. We have a highly probable coercive signature situation. Preston's commercial real estate project is underwater. I believe he is attempting to force a transfer of her separate trust assets tonight. I heard the sound of keys jingling on the other end of the line. I am on my way, Dana said. I have the blank revocation drafts and the emergency protective filing templates we discussed last month in my briefcase. Do we have law enforcement stepping in? I am making that call right now, I replied. Do not enter the property until I get there. Understood, Dana said, and the line went dead. I dialed the second number. Sheriff Tom Alvarez. Tom and I went back 20 years. We had run joint task forces when I was still active duty. He was not a man who bent the law for his friends, but he was a man who knew how to read the spaces between the words when I spoke. Tom, I said when he answered. It is Ray Hale. I need a welfare check at my daughter's address. Ray, it is almost midnight, Tom said, his voice heavy with sleep. Is this an emergency? I received a prearranged distress signal, I told him. My daughter is being held against her will. I believe her husband is utilizing coercive confinement to force a financial transaction. I am driving over there now. I am unarmed, and I am requesting an official presence to ensure the peace is kept while she is extracted. There was a brief silence on the line. Tom knew me. He knew I did not exaggerate. He knew I did not make frivolous calls. Raymond Hale does not call at midnight unless someone taught him to be worried, Tom said softly. I am sending 2 deputies. I will be in the second car. Do not do anything stupid before we get there, Ray. I won't have to, I said. I will see you there. I hung up the phone. I started the truck, backed out of my driveway, and headed toward Preston's neighborhood. I did not speed. I drove exactly the posted speed limit all the way down Interstate 670. I stopped completely at every red light. I needed my heart rate to be perfectly calm. I needed my mind to be completely clear. While I was driving through the quiet suburban streets, navigating the manufactured piece of Oakland County, Preston Vale was standing in his massive, open-concept kitchen, pouring a $300 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon for a man he owed $3 million. I would later learn exactly what was happening inside that house while I was on my way. I would see the sworn affidavits, read the police reports, and listen to Emily recount every terrifying second of that night. Preston had orchestrated a masterpiece of psychological pressure. He had not just invited a few people over for drinks. He had constructed a private signing dinner, a highly curated social event designed specifically to eliminate any possibility of Emily saying no. He had invited 5 guests. The first was Arthur Vance, his primary investor, a man who was rapidly losing patience with Preston's failing commercial project. The second was Arthur's corporate attorney. The third was Vivian Vale, Preston's mother, a woman who possessed old money arrogance without any of the actual money to back it up. The fourth and fifth were Grant Meeks and his assistant. Grant was a notary public and a disgraced former real estate lawyer who was perfectly willing to look the other way for the right price. Preston's strategy was simple and brutal. He wanted Emily to sign away her protected assets, but he knew that if he asked her in private, she would refuse. So he built a stage. He brought the audience into her living room. He wanted to place the documents on the dining room table, hand her a heavy gold pen, and force her to choose between signing her financial execution warrant or causing a massive, humiliating public scene in front of his wealthy investors and his hypercritical mother. He was banking on her social conditioning. He was betting his entire failing empire on the assumption that Emily was too polite, too well-raised, and too terrified of embarrassment to scream for help in front of guests eating pan-seared sea bass. When Emily had come downstairs earlier that evening, she had frozen on the bottom step. She saw the notary stamp sitting on the edge of the glass dining table. She saw the thick stack of legal documents arranged perfectly next to a crystal wine glass. She saw Vivian Vale sitting on the velvet sofa, swirling her wine and looking at Emily with absolute disdain. "Ah, there she is," Vivian had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, the woman of the hour. "Preston tells us you are finally going to start acting like a partner in this marriage." Emily had felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at Preston. He was smiling, a wide, charismatic smile that did not reach his cold, dead eyes. He walked over to her, wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, and pulled her against his side. His fingers dug painfully into her ribs. "Emily is incredibly supportive, Arthur," Preston said, projecting his voice across the room to the investor. "She understands that a temporary pledge of her separate trust assets is exactly what the Meridian project needs to cross the finish line. We are a team." Emily tried to pull away, but Preston's grip was like a vice. "Preston," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we did not agree to this. You told me this was just a dinner." Preston's smile never faltered, but his eyes narrowed to tiny, dark slits. "Excuse us for just a moment," he said smoothly to the guests. "My beautiful wife forgot to review the final addendum. I just need to clarify one small detail with her." He practically dragged her down the hallway and shoved her into the small, windowless laundry room off the kitchen. He closed the heavy wooden door behind them, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the dinner party. The moment the door clicked shut, the charismatic businessman vanished. He stepped into her personal space, backing her up against the humming washing machine. You will not embarrass me in front of them, Preston hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous frequency. Emily kept her eyes on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. This is my mother's trust, Preston. It is not yours. The house is not yours. You cannot do this. It becomes our future when you stop acting like a spoiled, selfish child, he snapped, slamming his hand flat against the washing machine, inches from her hip. Emily jumped, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Arthur Vance is ready to pull his funding tomorrow morning if I do not provide collateral. If he walks, the bank calls the loans. If the bank calls the loans, we lose everything. Do you understand me? Everything. It is your project, Emily whispered, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. It is your debt. Preston leaned in so close she could smell the heavy oak of the Cabernet on his breath. You are my wife. There is no yours and mine. There is only what I need to survive. Now, you are going to walk out there. You are going to smile at my mother. You are going to take the pen from Grant. And you are going to sign the pledge agreement, the refinance authorization, and the medical power of attorney. Emily's head snapped up. Medical power of attorney? Why do you need medical power of attorney? Preston smiled, a terrifying, patronizing smirk. Because you are clearly unstable, Emily. You have been acting erratically for months. You are emotionally fragile. If you refuse to sign the financial documents out there, I will have to explain to Arthur that my wife is currently suffering from a severe mental breakdown, and that as your designated medical proxy, I will be taking temporary conservatorship of your estate to protect you from yourself. A cold wave of absolute horror washed over Emily. It was not just about the money anymore. He was threatening to legally erase her. He had prepared a narrative. He had the notary waiting. He had his mother ready to testify to Emily's supposed instability. He was building a legal cage, and the door was swinging shut. She needed her phone. She needed to reach me. But her phone was in her pocket, and Preston was watching her every move. Preston held out his hand. Give me your phone, Emily. Emily froze. Why? Because you are stalling, he said, his fingers twitching. You are trying to figure out how to call your useless father so he can come over here and hold your hand. Give me the phone. You are not making any calls until those papers are signed. Emily reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the smooth glass of her phone screen. She knew she had roughly 5 seconds before Preston forcefully took it from her. She did not have time to call 911. If she did, he would snatch the phone, hang up, and tell the dispatcher his wife was having a manic episode. She did not have time to type out a long explanation. She needed a language only one person understood. She pulled the phone out of her pocket, unlocked the screen with her thumb, and opened our text thread. What are you doing? Preston demanded, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. Emily forced her hands to stop shaking. I am just asking him about the garage. She lied, her voice remarkably steady. You told me I needed to clean out my old boxes this weekend. I just want to ask him if he still has them. Then I will give you the phone. I promise. Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes in exasperation. Fine. Ask him about his garage junk. Then you hand it over and we go back out there. With Preston standing literally inches away from her, watching her fingers move across the illuminated screen, Emily typed the words I had taught her a decade ago. Dad, do you still have Mom's blue cooler? She hit send. Preston looked down at the screen. He read the words. He saw a harmless question about a piece of forgotten camping equipment. He saw a childish daughter clinging to memories. He saw exactly what she wanted him to see. Are you done? Preston asked, holding his hand out again. Emily typed the second message, her thumb moving precisely over the glass. No rush. Tomorrow is fine. She hit send again, locked the screen, and placed the phone gently into Preston's waiting palm. Preston slid her phone into his own jacket pocket. He reached out, grabbed her upper arm with bruising force, and pulled her toward the laundry room door. Good girl, he whispered, his tone mocking and victorious. Now, dry your eyes. We have guests waiting. and you have some paperwork to sign." He opened the door and led her back into the bright, perfectly lit dining room. Emily walked toward the table, feeling the eyes of the investors and the notary burning into her. She saw the heavy gold pen resting on top of the stack of legal documents. She saw Vivian Vale smiling at her from the sofa. She was surrounded by wolves, standing in the center of a perfectly orchestrated trap. But as she looked down at the documents, her heart was no longer racing with panic. It was beating with a steady, quiet rhythm. Preston thought he had just confiscated her only lifeline. He thought he had successfully cut her off from the outside world. He thought he had won. But Emily knew something Preston did not. She knew that her father had received the message. She knew that the blue cooler was no longer sitting empty on a shelf. She knew that the trap had just been inverted. And as she reached out a trembling hand to pick up the heavy gold pen, stalling for time, she knew that I was already on my way. I turned off the main highway and pulled into the gated entrance of Preston Vale's neighborhood. It was one of those manicured, ultra-exclusive subdivisions where every house looked like a glass and steel fortress, and every lawn was cut to the exact same geometric millimeter. My 12-year-old Ford pickup truck rattled as it rolled over the smooth imported cobblestone of his expansive circular driveway. I parked directly behind a pristine black Mercedes-Benz SUV that I assumed belonged to Arthur Vance, his primary investor. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment. I could see the soft, warm glow of the recessed lighting spilling out from the massive floor to ceiling windows of Preston's dining room. I could see shadows moving inside, the silhouettes of people drinking expensive wine, laughing politely, closing a deal. They had absolutely no idea that the foundation of their perfect evening was about to crack. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the battered blue plastic cooler. The white handle creaked slightly under the weight of the backup phone, the certified trust documents, and the digital recorder hidden beneath a layer of old camping towels. I stepped out of the truck, the heavy door shutting with a loud metallic clunk that echoed in the quiet, wealthy silence of the neighborhood. I walked up the wide stone steps to the massive double front doors. I did not ring the doorbell. I knocked, 4 firm, steady knocks with my bare knuckles. I waited. Through the frosted glass panels, I saw a shadow break away from the dining room table and move quickly down the hallway. The brass handle turned, and the heavy door swung open. Preston stood in the entryway. He was wearing a custom navy blue blazer, a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and the kind of expensive cologne that is meant to smell like old money. When he saw me standing there, holding a dusty camping cooler, the polite, charismatic host smile instantly vanished from his face. His jaw tightened, and a flash of genuine, unadulterated irritation crossed his eyes. "Ray," Preston said, keeping his voice low so the guests in the dining room would not hear, "what are you doing here? This is not really a good time. We are in the middle of a very important private dinner." I looked at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not look angry. I looked like a confused, eager to please old man. "Emily texted me," I said mildly. Lifting the blue cooler slightly, she asked if I still had her mother's old cooler. I figured she must have needed it tonight, so I drove it over. Preston stared at the plastic cooler, as if it were a piece of garbage I had just dragged onto his expensive Persian rug. He let out a short, incredulous sigh. "Ray, she did not mean for you to drop everything and bring it over at midnight. She was just asking a question. You really need to learn how to read the room." I did not move. I just stood on the welcome mat, holding the cooler. "Well, I am already here," I said, maintaining my polite, harmless facade. "It would be a shame to haul it all the way back to Saginaw. Why don't you ask Emily if she wants it now?" Preston's eyes narrowed. He looked past me, checking the street to see if any of the neighbors were watching his father-in-law stand on his porch like a delivery driver. Then he looked back at me, his irritation escalating into quiet anger. "Ray, I am going to say this as politely as I can. Go home. Emily is busy. We are signing some very sensitive financial documents, and we do not have time for a family reunion. He moved to close the door. I shifted my weight forward, placing the toe of my heavy work boot firmly against the threshold. The heavy wooden door hit the leather of my boot and stopped dead. Preston looked down at my boot and then back up at my face. His charismatic mask was completely gone now. "Excuse me," he demanded. I did not flinch. "Then just ask her to tell me she doesn't want it," I said. My voice dropping an octave, losing a fraction of its grandfatherly warmth. "If she tells me she doesn't need it, I will turn around and leave." Preston glared at me. He knew that causing a scene on his front porch would draw the attention of his investor and his mother. He knew that the quickest way to get rid of me was to simply produce Emily, let her dismiss me, and close the door. "Fine," Preston hissed. He turned his head over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off me. "Emily, come out here for a second. Your father decided to make a late-night delivery." I waited. 30 seconds later, Emily appeared from the dining room hallway. When I saw her, it took every ounce of training and discipline I possessed not to reach out and grab Preston by his expensive lapels. She was deathly pale. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was clutching her hands together so tightly her knuckles were white. But what struck me most was her posture. She looked like a prisoner of war being presented to a Red Cross inspector. Preston immediately stepped directly behind her. He placed his hands heavily on both of her shoulders, pulling her back against his chest in a grotesque display of possessive affection. "Look who decided to drop by." "Darling," Preston said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ray brought your old camping cooler. Tell him thank you, and tell him you do not need it tonight so we can get back to our guests." Emily looked at me. She looked at the blue cooler in my hands. The cooler that had carried extra sandwiches to Yellowstone. The cooler that carried the only language she had left. "Where do you want me to put your mother's cooler, Emily?" I asked quietly. Preston's fingers dug visibly into her shoulders. "You can just take it back, Ray," he answered for her. "We do not have space for it in the foyer." I kept my eyes locked entirely on my daughter. "I am asking Emily, Preston." The silence in the entryway was suffocating. I could hear the faint clinking of silverware from the dining room, the soft murmur of Vivian Vale complaining to the investor. Emily took a slow, trembling breath. She looked at the blue cooler and then she looked directly into my eyes. "By the back door," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "In case I need to leave early." There it was, the final piece of the code. The absolute confirmation that she was not just being coerced, but that she was ready to be extracted. "In case I need to leave early." Preston laughed, a dismissive, arrogant sound. "Leave early? Emily, we are hosting a dinner party in our own home. You are not leaving early." He looked at me, exasperated. "Just put it by the door, Ray, and have a good night. We really have to get back." He expected me to set the cooler down and walk away. He expected the quiet old barbecue man to obey. Instead, I stepped past him. I walked right over the threshold, ignoring Preston's sharp gasp of outrage, and strode directly down the hallway toward the dining room. I did not run. I walked with the slow, heavy, deliberate cadence of a man who owned the floor beneath his feet. "Ray, what the hell are you doing?" Preston demanded, dropping his hands from Emily's shoulders and rushing after me. "You cannot just barge into my house." I did not answer him. I walked into the massive, brightly lit dining room and set the heavy blue plastic cooler down on the pristine white oak hardwood floor. The plastic scraped loudly against the wood, a jarring, ugly sound that caused every single person at the table to freeze. I stood up straight and took inventory of the room. It was exactly as I had pictured it. The dining table was covered in expensive china and half-empty wine glasses. Sitting at the head of the table was Arthur Vance, the investor, looking confused and slightly annoyed by the interruption. Next to him was a man in a cheap suit, whom I immediately recognized as Grant Meeks, the dirty notary. He had his official stamp sitting on the glass table, right next to a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. And lounging on the velvet sofa in the corner was Vivian Vale, Preston's mother. She looked at me as if a stray dog had just wandered into her country club. "Preston," Vivian said, her voice sharp and nasal. "What is going on? Why is her father standing in your dining room with a piece of garbage?" Preston practically jogged into the room, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I am handling it, Mother," he snapped. He grabbed my arm, trying to physically turn me toward the hallway. "Ray, you are leaving. Right now. You are trespassing, and you are embarrassing Emily in front of our guests." I did not move. I let him pull on my arm. He was younger, and he was fit. But he lacked the grounded leverage of a man who had spent 3 decades wrestling violent fugitives into submission. I stood completely still, like an old oak tree rooted in concrete. I looked down at the stack of documents on the table. The top page was clearly visible. It was a pledge and security agreement listing the assets of the Sarah Hale Irrevocable Trust as collateral. Right beneath it was a revocation of separate property status form. I looked back at Preston, who was still futilely tugging on my sleeve. "What are we signing tonight, Preston?" I asked, my voice calm, projecting clearly across the silent dining room. Preston let go of my arm, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "None of your business," he spat. "This is a private financial matter between a husband and a wife. It has absolutely nothing to do with you." I looked past him, locking eyes with Grant Meeks, the notary. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly intensely interested in his own cuticles. "A private financial matter," I repeated slowly. "That requires a notary, an investor, and a captive audience at midnight." Vivian Vale stood up from the sofa, smoothing her expensive silk blouse. "A married woman should not keep running to her father every time her husband asks her to grow up," she announced to the room, shaking her head. "It is pathetic, honestly. Emily needs to learn that she is a Vale now. She has obligations to this family's future. Some men never learn when they are no longer needed." I did not even look at Vivian. I kept my eyes entirely on Preston. "If this is a voluntary financial decision, Preston," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, "why is my daughter shaking?" Everyone in the room turned to look at Emily. She was standing in the archway of the dining room, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist, visibly trembling. Preston stepped between me and Emily, blocking my view of her. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Ray, you fix lawnmowers," Preston said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You grill burgers. You live in a 2-bedroom house in Saginaw. You do not understand how families with real assets make decisions. You don't understand commercial debt structures. You don't understand collateralization. This is over your head. Now get out of my house before I call the police." I looked at him. The man who reacts first almost never wins. I let the silence hang in the room for 5 agonizing seconds. "I understand coercion," I said softly. Preston laughed, a harsh, panicked bark. "Coercion? Big word for a barbecue man." I did not get a chance to respond, because at that exact moment, the heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed 3 times. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent, tense house. Preston froze. He looked at the hallway and then he looked back at me, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his eyes for the first time. "Are you expecting someone else?" Vivian demanded, clutching her wine glass. I looked down at the blue cooler sitting on the floor. I reached down, popped the white plastic latch, and flipped the lid open. I reached past the backup phone and the recording device, and I pulled out the certified copies of Emily's original trust documents. "No," I said, straightening up and placing the documents directly on top of Preston's coercive pledge agreement. "I'm not expecting anyone. They are already here." The heavy front door had not been fully latched when Preston tried to shut it on me earlier. It swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud, and into the bright, expensive foyer of Preston Vale's perfect life walked Sheriff Tom Alvarez, followed by 2 uniformed deputies, and Dana Cross, holding her leather briefcase. The private signing dinner was officially over. The trap had been sprung, but the man caught inside the cage was not the quiet old barbecue man. The sudden appearance of 3 uniformed law enforcement officers and a woman in a sharp business suit completely shattered the carefully curated atmosphere of Preston Vale's dining room. The heavy, suffocating tension that Preston had relied on to break Emily was instantly replaced by genuine, unpredictable chaos. Arthur Vance, the investor, pushed his chair back from the glass table, the legs scraping loudly against the wood. His corporate attorney stood up immediately, stepping away from the stack of documents as if they had suddenly caught fire. Preston took a staggering step backward, his charismatic facade dissolving into pure panic. He looked at Sheriff Alvarez, then at the deputies, and finally back at me. "You called the police?" Preston choked out, his voice cracking, completely losing its polished resonance. "You brought the police into my house?" I did not move from my spot in front of the blue cooler. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the sudden noise in the room. "My daughter did. You just did not know how to read the call." Sheriff Alvarez stepped fully into the dining room, his thumbs hooked casually into his utility belt, but there was nothing casual about his eyes. He scanned the room, taking in the frightened young woman, the angry husband, the open legal documents, and the disgraced notary. "Evening, folks," Sheriff Alvarez said, his deep voice commanding absolute attention. "We received a report of a possible coercive confinement and a request for a welfare check on Emily Vale." Preston threw his hands up in the air, forcing a hysterical, unconvincing laugh. "This is insane. Coercive confinement? Tom, I know you. I am a prominent business owner in this county. We are having a dinner party. My wife is right here." He reached out to grab Emily's arm again. But before his fingers could even brush the fabric of her sleeve, one of the deputies stepped forward, resting his hand firmly on Preston's chest. "Step back, sir," the deputy said sharply. While Preston was being neutralized, Dana Cross, my attorney, walked purposefully over to the glass dining table. She completely ignored Grant Meeks, the notary, who was already sweating profusely and packing up his leather briefcase. Dana looked down at the documents resting next to the gold pen. She picked up the pledge and security agreement. She flipped through the first 3 pages, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with practiced efficiency. "This is fascinating," Dana said, her voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "A pledge and security agreement specifically targeting the Sarah Hale Irrevocable Trust. A trust which, as I am sure Mr. Meeks here knows, is completely protected separate property under state law." She dropped the agreement back onto the table and picked up the medical power of attorney form. "And an emergency medical conservatorship draft," she continued, raising an eyebrow, "prepared without a physician's affidavit. That is a very aggressive legal strategy, Preston. It is also textbook financial abuse." Arthur Vance, the investor, looked at Preston, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "Preston," Vance demanded, his voice thick with fury, "did your wife voluntarily agree to this collateral transfer? You explicitly assured me in an email this morning that she was fully on board. You wrote, and I quote, 'Once she signs, her father can scream all he wants.'" Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Arthur Vance, realizing his entire financial lifeline was evaporating right in front of him. Grant Meeks grabbed the handle of his briefcase and tried to slide past the table toward the hallway. "I think I am going to step outside," Grant muttered, his eyes darting toward the front door. "This seems like a private family dispute." I stepped smoothly into his path, blocking his exit. "A forced signature does not become voluntary just because your notary stamp is expensive, Grant," I said quietly. "I would suggest you leave your briefcase right there on the table. The sheriff's department is going to want to take a look at your logbook." Grant swallowed hard, dropping the briefcase back onto the glass table. Sheriff Alvarez walked over to Emily. She was still trembling, but she was standing taller now. The suffocating weight of the trap had been lifted. "Emily," Alvarez said gently, dropping the authoritative tone he had used with Preston. "Are you being held here against your will? Do you want to leave this house?" Emily looked at Preston. She saw the man who had spent 2 years slowly chipping away at her independence. The man who had mocked her father, isolated her from her friends, and tried to steal her mother's legacy to cover his own failures. Then she looked at me. "Yes," Emily said, her voice echoing clearly through the dining room. Her voice did not shake. "I want to leave, and I am not signing a single page on that table." Preston's panic finally boiled over into raw, desperate anger. "You are not going anywhere," he snarled, trying to push past the deputy. "She is my wife. You cannot just take her out of her own house." "She is not your property, Preston," I said, my voice hardening into stone. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing, Ray." Preston screamed, completely losing control, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have no idea what I can do to her financially. I will bury her. I will tie that trust up in litigation for a decade." The room fell dead silent. Even Vivian Vale, who had been sitting frozen on the sofa, gasped at the sheer ugliness of her son's outburst. Dana glanced down at the open blue cooler. "For the record, Preston, that was beautifully clear," she said calmly. Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but Arthur Vance's attorney turned to her and said, "Mrs. Vale, if I were you, I would stop describing this as family business before someone starts describing you as a witness." Preston turned his rage back on me. "You are nothing," he screamed, his face inches from the deputy's chest. "You are a retired mechanic who plays with lawnmowers. You cannot walk into my house and destroy my life." Sheriff Alvarez sighed heavily. He looked at Preston with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "Preston," Alvarez said, slowly emphasizing every word, "you really might want to stop talking now." Preston glared at him, breathing heavily. "Why?" "Because you are currently screaming at a man who trained half the law enforcement officers in this county on coercive control extractions," Alvarez explained, his voice cold and flat. "Raymond Hale was securing federal witnesses and breaking down cartel safehouses before you were old enough to forge a loan application." The color drained entirely from Preston's face. He stared at me. He looked at my faded flannel shirt, my heavy work boots, and my calloused hands. The illusion he had built in his mind, the illusion of the weak, useless old man, shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "You," Preston stammered, his eyes wide. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just reached down and picked up the blue plastic cooler. "I retired from the badge, Preston," I told him quietly. I did not retire from recognizing locked doors. I walked over to Emily and gently placed my hand on her back. "Let's go home," I said. We walked out the front door together. The deputies escorted us to my truck, ensuring Preston did not try to follow. As I started the engine and put the truck in gear, I looked in the rearview mirror. I could see Arthur Vance and his attorney storming out of the house, throwing their hands up in disgust. I could see Grant Meeks sitting on the front steps, holding his head in his hands, realizing his career was over. Preston Vale's empire had collapsed in less than 20 minutes. The aftermath was swift and uncompromising. Emily moved into a secure, gated apartment complex the next day. Dana Cross filed the emergency protective order, which was granted immediately based on the police report and the witness testimonies from the dinner party. Arthur Vance's attorney sent one email terminating the funding before breakfast the next morning. By Monday, the sign outside Preston Vale Development had been removed from the office door. Preston's bank accounts were frozen pending a forensic review of his business practices. Grant Meeks was reported to the state licensing board, and an investigation into his previous notarizations was opened. A week later, my phone rang. It was Vivian Vale. She screamed at me for 10 minutes, accusing me of destroying her son's marriage and ruining her family's good name. I waited until she ran out of breath. "No, Vivian," I said calmly. "I just opened a door. Your son showed everyone exactly what he had locked inside." Then I hung up. Emily and I spent the next few months slowly rebuilding. There was a lot of healing to do. Coercive control leaves invisible scars that take time to fade, but she was safe. She had her independence, and she had her mother's legacy completely intact. One evening, I went over to her new apartment to help her mount a television on the wall. When I walked into her living room, I saw the battered blue plastic cooler sitting on a shelf near the front door. I looked at her, raising an eyebrow. Emily smiled, a real, genuine smile. "To Preston it was a piece of junk from your garage," she said softly. "But to me it was a door I could still open, without him ever seeing the key." Preston Vale spent 2 years meticulously teaching my daughter that every single door in her life required his permission to open. He thought he had successfully trapped her in a cage of his own design. But he forgot one very important thing. Long before she was his wife, she was my daughter, and I had taught her how to call for help without making a single sound. Some deals you close because there is no version of yourself you can live with that walks away from the table. If you were in my shoes, would you have confronted Preston privately first, to spare him the embarrassment? Or did he deserve to be exposed in front of every investor, lawyer, and family member he had gathered to pressure Emily into signing her life away? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next one.